Good morning, friends. Welcome to our program for this morning. Before we start our devotional part, we would like to let you know as a disclaimer that we're going to be recording this program. And we're going to start with our devotional part first. And then we want to thank Dr. Augusto Lopez-Claros for discussing with us today. It's his third conversation with us this morning. And then we would like to start with the devotional part. If you feel comfortable enough to share your screen, to share your faces, could be great. If not, that's okay too. So, Maria June, we can start, I think. If I'm missing something, please let me know.
Thank you. And thank you, Alina and Dr. Lopez, for being here. This has been in celebration and honoring Latinx Heritage Month. And we can't really thank you enough for being with us to honor the beautiful heritage that you have shared with us, the knowledge of what's happening around the world. And we just wanted to express our indebted gratitude.
Yeah.
¿Quién libra de las dificultades salvo Dios? Di alabado sea Dios. Él es Dios. Todos somos sus siervos y todos nos atenemos a su mandato.
Thank you. Now we're going to continue with information from United Nations about indigenous people in Latin America and what has been done to help the indigenous friends around the world. Thank you, Maria.
At present, Latin America is home to 826 indigenous peoples, which, by the year 2010, included nearly 45 million people, accounting for 8% of the region's population. The countries with the greatest proportion of indigenous peoples are Bolivia, Guatemala, Peru, and Mexico. There is huge diversity among indigenous peoples, with some remaining in voluntary isolation and others coexisting in big cities. Brazil has the greatest amount of indigenous peoples, followed by Colombia, Peru, and Mexico. Indigenous peoples represent one of the most disadvantaged groups in the region and have suffered the systematic loss of their lands, with severe consequences to their well-being. Nevertheless, the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, ECLAC, has found some progress in recent years related to the recognition of their territorial rights and political participation. There have also been improvements in their living conditions, with greater access to healthcare and education. The United Nations has championed the promotion of indigenous peoples' rights and relies on 3 special resources for this purpose: a permanent forum, experts, a special rapporteur. At a regulatory level, indigenous peoples are protected by Convention number 169 of the International Labor Organization of 1989, which recognized their rights as peoples for the first time, and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples of 2007, which considers these peoples' rights to self-determination. In the context of these efforts, ECLAC calls for the region's countries to put policies in practice to end inequality suffered by indigenous peoples. policies based on human rights standards, and the perspectives and contributions of these peoples. This is crucial for the construction of a new development agenda beyond 2015, with equality at its heart.
Thank you, Paria June. We appreciate the information. We will now hear a video that it's about the story of protecting indigenous cultures. This is throughout the world. Thank you.
At times, they seem forgotten, but Latin America consists of approximately 45 million indigenous people who belong to 800 different ethnic groups. For centuries, a colonial mindset denied indigenous cultures by describing and treating them as inferior. Now, there is a reivindication as concepts like collective rights and respect for nature reappears in public discourse.
The indigenous people are there, and we are hearing them every day more and more, and they are very strong. And now we are finding that a lot with our whole climate crisis, we're finding that we have to live with the planet and that we are part of nature. And it's the indigenous people that understand that. If you listen nowadays to talk about Pachamama, Mother Earth, you'll see that the rights of nature are in the Constitution of Bolivia, of Ecuador. You will see that Colombia has declared the Amazon as subject of rights. But who brought up this question? The indigenous people. It's the indigenous agenda that's getting into the Constitution.
Martin von Hildebrand has spent his life working in conservation. His work is a call to embrace indigenous rights and their traditional knowledge. As the founder of the Gaia Foundation, von Hildebrand worked to create the world's largest ecocultural corridor that protects up to 230 million hectares of rainforest stretching across the Andes, Amazon, and Atlantic coast.
One of the things we have to do is take other cultures seriously, take the indigenous people seriously, listen to them, make the effort. We don't make it. If we take Colombia, where we are now, and somebody like belonging to middle class wants to go deep, they go to India to learn Buddhism. And we have them here in La Sierra Nevada, Santa Marta. We have 80 indigenous cultures. We don't listen to them. But we go to where the Beatles went.
Von Hildebrand says celebrating indigenous culture is not denying the contributions made by other cultures and moments in history such as industrialization. It is recognizing that the indigenous culture mindset has been missing for a more harmonious way of life.
Now, I'm not saying that science and technology are not important, but it's not enough. Because the problem is not technical, and not only technical, it's ethical. Who are we? What are we doing? Who is our neighbor? How do we have to live? How do we have to take care of nature? And this is something that should be learned in school.
With environmental movements across Latin America, the indigenous culture is being acknowledged again, and they are leading us into the future.
Whereas the indigenous people see nature as a community, they see it as a subject, a communion of subjects. Everybody important. It's a big community, we belong to it. And this is where the world is going. So I think we're walking towards the indigenous people, towards their way of thinking. They're not the past, they're the present, and they're going to be the future.
Michelle Begue-CGTN, Bogotá, Colombia.
Thank you, Paria June. That was very good information. So we can, this is the intention of this program is that we learn from what indigenous people are going through in Latin America and all the horrors they are going through. So it's with the intent to educate ourselves in learning about our culture and to share with you guys all the work that has to be done and that we are still far away from it, but that we have to put ourselves in the shoes of those who are going through all these things. Thank you so much.
todo o tempo aí a gente lutou muito para a demarcação, né? Que foi sair agora em 2016, né? Então, foi uma luta grande aí, de 15 anos mais ou menos, 14, 15 anos, né? Mas estamos aí mantendo a luta. A gente luta para não mudar as leis, né? Dessa terra, então é importante. Esse é o objetivo nosso, né? Manter a terra com os indígenas.
Eu não me vejo morando fora da aldeia. Isso aqui para mim é muito importante, né? A nossa tradição, nossa cultura. E assim, é lutar mesmo, ir pra luta para não perder isso daqui que é muito importante pra gente, né? A nossa cultura. Eu me orgulho muito de ser indígena.
Nós temos que assegurar os dias de amanhã dos nossos filhos, dos netos, dos bisnetos, porque até então o Brasil pertencia aos índios e, no entanto, agora só tem pouquíssima terra para eles sobreviver, né?
Meu nome em português é Kelly, eu tenho 18 anos, acabei de completar 18 anos. Eu sou a cacique mais nova do Brasil e eu vim para mostrar que as mulheres também podem, né?
Sou o único pajé ainda que está ainda cuidando do nosso povo aqui, né? Então estou passando, ensinando alguma coisa que sei ainda do meu povo do ano passado, que estou passando para a mocidade de hoje, daqui indígena.
Que a gente vê que hoje muitos indígenas têm vergonha de falar que é indígena. E a escola dentro da aldeia, ela ensina ele a ser o que ele é. Não ter vergonha do que é ser indígena.
Eu tenho acompanhado as entrevistas do presidente, eu acho que vai ser mais complicado, porque ele disse que não vai demarcar mais terra, né? E isso para mim é muito preocupante. Mas mesmo assim, por outro lado, se nós resistimos 500 anos, então eu acho que a gente vai continuar resistindo.
Não vai ter 1 centímetro demarcado para reserva indígena ou para quilombola.
Thank you, Parajan. This video you shared with us, it is so important and relevant to keep in mind the protection of indigenous land, and sadly through corruption, people have been eradicated from their own land. So it would be important to get educated about what things we can do to help them. And now we will continue with the prayer in Spanish. Thank you so much.
Oh, Señor, oh, Señor, oh, Señor, haz radiante a este joven y confiere tu generosidad a esta pobre criatura. Señor, otórgale conocimiento, concédele más fuerza al romper el alba cada mañana y resguárdalo al amparo de tu protección. poderosa pueda guiar a los descarriados, encaminar a los desventurados, liberar a los cautivos y despertar a los desatentos, para que todos sean bendecidos con tu recuerdo y tu alabanza, para que todos sean bendecidos con tu recuerdo y tu alabanza. Tú eres el poderoso, oh, tú eres el poderoso, y el potente, oh, y el potente.
Before we continue with the conversation with Dr. Lopez, we would like to share a poem by a Mexican girl. And just to let you know, there's a word out there that she uses for the purpose of empowerment. So even though it's like not great word, but it's for the purpose of empowerment. It's a good poem. And also to remind you again that this program is being recorded in case you would like to share later or see it in the YouTube channel. Thank you.
They tell me I'm not really Mexican. As if my Latina could be determined by how many times I can move my hips. Like, no, I can't dance, but the cumbia still moves through my veins like mi mama moved through the house, with the piri-pi-pi echoing down the hall and the smell of chilaquiles on Sunday morning. They tell me I'm not really Mexican. As if my grito wasn't authentic enough, as if my overprivileged brown ass didn't know how to tortear. Having to prove that I can keep a conversation in Spanish, my identity is stripped with grammatical errors. And I guess I'm not really Mexican. Because I refused to wear hoop earrings because I didn't want to look chola, but what I meant was too Mexican. Felt like if I could blend in, that was okay, as if earrings could point me out while trying to hide an accent, because I don't want to be made fun of for saying chipotle, but yes, can I have the surfitas and veggies, please? Introducing myself as Letitia to make others comfortable. I don't correct them when they shorten it to Letty. But my name is Leticia, and mis amigos call me Leti. In interviews, when I'm asked if I'm anything but Mexican, given the sorry, you just don't seem hardworking, independent, chingona, told that I wasn't really Mexican because my playlist consists of too many rap songs, that I shop like I'm not broke because my pocha ass knows no struggle. But just because I'm not a DreamAct student doesn't mean I'm not a dreamer. We internalize racism while idiots in government want to build a wall that's already built. We protest racism. We protest racism while practicing it like we're training to prove a point, training to stand up, but we're failing to understand each other. Too American for the Mexicans and too Mexican for the whites. I'm bicultural, not assimilated, but sometimes I wished I was. When I wished my skin wasn't brown and that I didn't have to fight to legitimize my identity or fight to feel safe. I'm tangled through trenzas like Spanglish and queerness, trying to understand the skin that makes me indigenous. But I'm finding empowerment in Chicana and Chingona, because who knows what it means to be really Mexican anyways. Too spicy, not so exotic, strict parents, sangrona, broken English, no broken pride. Soy mexicana. Gracias.
Yo, keep that going.
Thank you so much. And we would like to introduce and thank Dr. Lopez for his selflessly, because he has selflessly come every Sunday after Sunday. This is his third conversation with us, which will be about economic governance in a post-COVID world. Thank you, Dr. Lopez, for coming and sharing your knowledge with us today. Thank you.
Good morning, Alina. It's a pleasure to be back with you today, I guess, for the last time in this series. And last Sunday, we had talked about humanity and the path to a just global order. And it occurred to me that it would be good today, perhaps, to talk a little bit about the kinds of weaknesses and flaws, if you wish, which COVID-19 has exhibited in the kind of economic system that we have that has emerged in the last several decades. You know, this crisis of the last 18 months, which is still ongoing, has been, you know, one of the most intense economic crises that we have had in the last 100 years. We can debate whether we need to go back further into the past or not. But it's certainly been the most severe crisis that we have had since the Great Depression of the late 1920s, early 1930s. And it has, of course, as you very well know, been a global crisis. No country in the world has been unaffected by it. And unlike other crises in the past, it has also been very, very democratic in its impact. Among the fatalities, we have had poor people, rich people, people from all backgrounds, social, religious, ethnic. It seems that the virus makes no distinctions of class, makes no distinctions of race and ethnicity and nationality. Of course, there are many numbers or statistics that highlight the strength of the crisis, and I will share with you just two. One of them pertains specifically to the United States, and it came out actually in the last few days, which is that in the United States, COVID-19 has killed more people than were killed, that is, among Americans, in the two world wars, as well as the Korean War and the Vietnam War. Furthermore, more people have died of COVID so far than died of the Spanish flu of 1918, 1919, which, if you look at the figures historically, has been, of course, the most deadly pandemic in the world's history, killing, you know, somewhere between 50 and 100 million people. It is of some significance that COVID-19 has actually killed more people in the US than the Spanish flu. The other statistic, which also highlights the universal nature of this crisis, is what has happened with the poverty numbers. You know that we have made consistent, gradual progress over the last 30 years in reducing the incidence of poverty, especially extreme poverty. And yet, for the first time in 2020, we have seen a reversal of this trend. Somewhere between 100 and 120 million people in the world in the last 18 months have been reclassified as being extremely poor. They had graduated from that characterization, now they're back in it. And this, to me, is perhaps more than anything else, you know, a evidence of not only the impact of COVID, but also of the flaws of our economic system. The fact that we have not been able to prevent this calamity from happening in the first place. And so, to begin this conversation, what I like to do is I like to share with you some thoughts on the subject of poverty from a Baha'i perspective. You know, the central figures of the Baha'i faith, the founder, Baha'u'llah, and especially his son, Abdul Baha, had very strong views on poverty and what to do about it. Abdul Baha, as you know, or maybe not all of you know, but I will tell you, he traveled extensively in North America in the year 1912. And he spoke repeatedly on the issue of poverty and the related question of the distribution of income, what he called the extremes of wealth and poverty. He said that when we see, I'm going to quote, he said, some being enormously rich and others lamentably poor, an organization is necessary to control and improve this state of affairs. When we see poverty allowed to reach a condition of starvation, it is a sure sign that somewhere we shall find tyranny. And then he urged us to tackle this problem with urgency, because he said that it is not legitimate, it is not fair to live in a world in which vast segments of the human family live in grinding poverty and demoralizing and degrading poverty. Those are his words. You know, it's interesting, but let me give you a little bit of the context. You know, these words were said in 1912, a little more than 100 years ago. And Abdul Baha was actually a very keen observer of the economic, the social, the political surroundings in the United States as he was traveling around the country. If you actually do a little bit of study of what were the conditions faced by the majority of people in the United States at that time, you know, they were extremely difficult. The average work week for your typical worker were 12-hour work days, 6 days a week. That was your typical working week. If you were a coal miner, coal miners were dying in large numbers, you know, due to accidents or other environmental hazards. Child labor was rampant. There were millions of children who were actually working and not going to school. And in the few states where there were actually some restrictions on child labor, they were very poorly enforced. There was no income tax, there was no social security, there was no unemployment insurance. And then all of these things came later in the 1930s when President Roosevelt introduced many of these social innovations. Access to clean water was in rural areas was very limited. And in fact, many, many millions of Americans had no reliable access to heating in the wintertime. The incidence of tuberculosis was sky high by today's standards. And this is the United States, which at that time was already, you know, one of the more developed, one of the more prosperous nations in the world. If you went beyond the borders of the United States, if you looked at India, just to contrast, at that time, you know how many people died of the Spanish flu in India during the years 1918, 1919, 17 million people. That was 5.5% of the Indian population was wiped out by the pandemic. And this was because living conditions were so dire that the pandemic basically spread like wildfire, you know, infecting millions and millions of people and causing as many fatalities in India as all the fatalities of World War I, which happened around the same time, you know, between 1914 and 1918. So why do I share these numbers with you? Essentially just to highlight, you know, that this is one of the serious remaining problems. Our economic system has brought a great deal of prosperity. It has brought a great deal of scientific and technological innovation. We have conquered many diseases. Smallpox was conquered in 1980, you know, 40 years ago. Smallpox used to kill 2 million people per year. until finally, through the good work of the World Health Organization, it was eliminated in 1980. So this huge blight on humanity, was finally set aside through a great deal of international cooperation. Right? But poverty remains a very serious problem, and it is one of the consequences of COVID-19. It has underscored, the extent to which our economic system is flawed in many fundamental ways, and I will come to that in a few minutes. The founder of the Baha'i faith, he wrote a letter in the late 1860s to rulers and the kings of the world at that time, and he admonished them and he brought to their attention the critical importance of doing something about poverty. And let me share with you those words. It's just a few sentences, but I think they, in a very compelling way, they illustrate the importance that he attached to it, the elimination of poverty and addressing the needs of the poor. He said to these rulers that they should know that the poor are the trust of God in your midst. Watch, he warned them, that you betray not his trust, that you deal not unjustly with them, and that you walk in the ways of the treacherous. You will most certainly be called upon to answer for his trust on the day when the balance of justice shall be set, the day when unto everyone shall be rendered his due, when the doings of all men, be they rich or poor, shall be weighed. In other words, he's saying in this very poetic, allegorical language, that their stewardship of power as rulers, as kings and governors of the world, that the extent to which, through the power that they exercise, they dealt with the issue of poverty and the condition of the poor, would be something that ultimately they would be judged on. Judged by who? I guess the implication here is by God, by the Almighty. Now, I want to highlight, to talk about poverty. Many people think that it is essentially sort of having low levels of income, right? Not having the resources, the financial resources, to do the things that one would aspire. Whether it is taking care of our families, being able to afford medications when we need them, having savings when we lose our job and we have to look for another job, and so on. And all those, of course, are features of the poor. But there is more than that. There is more than that, especially when you take a look at a global perspective. Now, we live in a very integrated world. There is a reality beyond the borders of the United States where most of you are living. And, poverty is an everyday phenomenon for the vast majority of the population. And it is associated with malnourishment. It is associated with illiteracy. And increasingly, it's also associated with fragility and conflict. Most of the conflicts in the world, most of the civil wars, most of the violent conflicts that are taking place in the world today happen to be in countries where there is a great deal of poverty, because it leads to frustration, because in the context of the great visibility that we have through social media and other communications technologies about the lifestyle of people, especially in the richer parts of the world, people know, they can see their condition, they can contrast, and this leads to a great deal of frustration and increasingly social instability. Now, one question is, what sort of lessons can we get can we infer from COVID-19? What, if we had to say, what does COVID-19 tell us about the economic system that we have, and what are some of the things that we need to do? Many things might come to your mind, and what I will do in the next 15 minutes is basically give you an overview of what I consider to be some of these lessons. One of them, obviously, is that governments everywhere are not deploying their resources, in ways that prioritize human welfare. If you look at the figures on illiteracy, we have something like 800 million people in the world who can't read and write. They're not in the United States by and large. They happen to be located in Africa, in India, in South Asia, in some of the poorest countries in the world. Abdul Baha, in talking about the importance of education, he urged nations to push the frontiers of knowledge. In fact, in explaining what were the causes for the prosperity and the progress in Europe in the 19th century, he attributed this largely to the priority which European nations had given to the training of people and to the education, to their effort to push the frontiers of knowledge, outward. He said that the education and training of children is among the most meritorious acts of humankind. For education, I'm quoting, is this indispensable foundation of all human excellence. So in the writings of the Baha'i faith, there is a great deal of emphasis placed on education, on knowledge, on the acquisition of skills, on learning, because it is seen as a very important instrument for empowerment and for pulling yourself, your family, your loved ones out of the limitations and the degradations of poverty. So one of the lessons then that I would draw from COVID-19 is that governments need to be much more judicious, much more careful in the way that we prioritize, the spending that governments do. Everywhere in the world, the United States is not an exception. The government draws up a budget every year, and this budget very often establishes priorities, establishes how the state is going to support the private sector in the achievement of important social and economic ends. And it seems to me that we are not prioritizing education and training to the extent that we should. Of course, in the same way, you could say that we're not prioritizing health in the way that we should. And COVID-19 has shown just how vulnerable our health systems are. Everywhere, not just the poor countries, even in some of the rich countries, COVID-19 has put huge deal of pressures on hospitals, on beds, on the whole public health infrastructure. And in many, many parts of the world, many people have died in ways that could have been prevented if we had had a more efficient public health infrastructure. So this is a kind of a second example, but perhaps the third and most important one, and I go back to one of the talks that Abdul Baha gave in America in 1912. 1912 was a very interesting period. Europe was getting ready for what would come 2 years later, World War I. Nations were spending a great deal of money building up weapons and strengthening their military establishments in anticipation of some kind of conflagration. World War I didn't just come overnight. There was a period of preparation. There was an arms race that was taking place in Europe, that eventually led to a spark, which then ignited the European continent and eventually brought in the United States as well, when President Wilson decided to be part of that war effort. Abdul Baha said the following. He said that the greatest catastrophe in the world of humanity today is war. He didn't say poverty, he said war. All the European nations are on edge, and a single flame will set on fire the whole of that continent, which is exactly what happened. This is 1912. 2 years later, a member of the nobility was shot and killed in Sarajevo, and that is what ignited the First World War. And then Abdul Baha goes on and he says, implements of war and death, these weapons, are multiplied and increased to an inconceivable degree, and the burden of military maintenance is taxing the various countries beyond the point of endurance. And then he laments, he laments how the innocent and the helpless are being forced by taxation, to provide for these war preparations, for these munitions and armaments. So he understood very well what was happening, right? And yet that aspect of our economy, the resources that we allocate to weapons, to what Abdul Baha in another context called the malignant fruits of civilization, has remained a permanent feature of our economic system. In fact, it has grown over the last 100 years. Today, the military establishment, or sometimes what President Eisenhower used to call the military-industrial complex, is a very, very important part of the economy of many, many countries in the world. And for me, this represents a misallocation of resources. Instead of spending more money on education and public health, on those things that contribute in some way to the welfare of the people, we're allocating resources essentially for war preparations. And this is something that should be condemned. It is not something that is acceptable in today's world, especially against the context of, so many millions of people who have been felled by COVID-19, and so many more which will continue to be felled in coming weeks and months because of the fact that we have not succeeded as much as we should have with vaccinations, the fact that vaccination rates in many of the poor countries in the world are extremely low, and so on and so forth. In fact, I guess if rethinking how we allocate our resources is one important consequence of this crisis, I would go then to say that, in fact, we need to rethink entirely the concepts of security. Especially in the context of democracies, that politicians have to put up themselves to the voters, every few years, right? Whether they aspire to be heads of state or senators or congressmen and so on, they all have to promise something to their constituents. They have to say, this is what I stand for, right? And everybody loves to talk about national security. If you ask your senator or your candidate for president, do you think that national security is important? Are you strong on national security? He will tell you, yes, of course. How could it be otherwise, right? And yet the concept of national security that we have is a concept that is very militaristic in its sort of scope, in its definition. It usually means a strong army. It usually means having the machinery, the weapons, the capacity to defeat our opponents, to bomb them into oblivion if necessary. And in the context of nuclear powers, it means maintaining our nuclear weaponry ready to go at a moment's notice. And let me ask you, however, in 2020, in the middle of the pandemic, how useful were nuclear weapons to you, the American members of the audience? I see many of your faces from my screen. Did the fact that the United States, or if you were a Russian, the fact that Russia or China or Pakistan or India, were you in some way helped by the fact that your country has nuclear weapons, that it has the ability to destroy the world at a moment's notice? And the honest answer to this question is no, those weapons were completely useless. You would have been far more helped if your government had hospitals that were better prepared, if they had ready access to many of the things that were in short not available when we needed them, like oxygen tanks and beds and masks and so on, especially during the early part of the pandemic. So you see, maybe national security should be redefined in terms of a country's ability to be ready for the next pandemic, in terms of a country's ability to deal with the calamities that climate change will visit upon humanity in coming years and decades. Maybe national security should be fundamentally about human welfare, about being able to have good educational systems that will train our young people so that when they graduate from university or high school, they will be able to integrate themselves into the job market and have a way to support themselves and support their families and so on and so forth. So you see, I think COVID-19 has shown really how misguided is this notion of national security that we have, which is linked to the military and to weapons instead of human welfare. So to me, that is perhaps one of the most important lessons to be gained from this pandemic. But there are others, and I don't want to overextend myself. You have been very kind so far, but it seems to me that one of the weaknesses in our system is that we need to modernize our institutions. You know, institutions are tremendously important. They are the way in which we confront problems. You know, Shoghi Effendi wrote a letter in 1931. Shoghi Effendi, the head of the Baha'i community in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and he said this letter was written in 1931, and this was sort of the worst of the global depression, the Great Depression, right? So there was a great deal of unrest, a great deal of dissatisfaction, a great deal of suffering throughout the world because of this great economic crisis. And he said, in looking at the causes of this situation, he said the fundamental cause of world unrest is our failure to adjust our system of economic and political institutions to the imperative needs of a rapidly evolving age. In other words, he was saying the world has changed a great deal in the 19th century and in the early part of the 20th century, but our institutions have not adapted to those changes. And because of this, you know, we have unrest and we have dissatisfaction, we have poverty, and we have a whole range of other social ills. And what I really find fascinating about this quote is that it remains so sort of relevant, so modern in its diagnosis, because of course, 90 years later, in the year 2021, it remains the case that our institutions have not adapted themselves to the needs of a rapidly evolving age. The United Nations was created in 1945, and its constitution, that is called the Charter, the UN Charter, has not been amended once. When the Charter was written in 1945, climate change was not in the horizon. It was not a problem that we could identify. The great problems of the 1940s in the context against the background of World War II were peace and security issues. And so the Charter focuses a lot on peace and security, but it has nothing to say about climate change. And therefore, as an institution, the United Nations is not empowered to deal with the problem of climate change, which is a much more urgent problem today than issues than other problems, which were the problems of the 1940s. So Shoghi Effendi would repeat this. He might say it in a different way. He might use different language if he were alive today, but his diagnosis would be exactly the same, that our institutions remain ossified, they remain unable to solve the problems that we face. And for that reason, what is happening is that we're proceeding in a very chaotic, very haphazard way. Our politicians are, by and large, energized about climate change. And so a few years ago, in 2015, they got together in Paris and they drew up an agreement, which on the positive side, recognized the need to reduce emissions and to address the problem of climate change. But on the negative side, was not accompanied by any kind of binding commitments, And so what has happened since 2015 is that emissions have, instead of going down, they have gone up. They have gone up by some 16%. And so we are farther away in 2021 than where we need to go very, very soon if we are going to avoid calamity, which is a drastic reduction in emissions. And one of the reasons for this failure is not a lack of understanding of the dangers that are before us, but it is essentially that we don't have the institutions to actually allow us to address this problem in a meaningful, binding way, right? And so that would be, to me, something else, another lesson that this crisis highlights in a very important way, that our system is deeply flawed, and increasingly these flaws are going to have, very painful consequences for humanity. You might say, well, what to do then? What are some of the solutions? What kind of tweaks would one make to one's economic system? And this is obviously a large subject, and I'm not going to give a talk on this when I have 5 minutes to go. But I think that one of the problems we have with our economic system is we have tended to emphasize too much the whole question of scale. Right? When you look at the media, you look at the comments made by politicians, by commentators on television, and so on, when it refers to the economy, the emphasis is always on the scale of economic activity. Right? Everybody's happy if the economy is growing and jobs are being created. Everybody's unhappy and very, very worried if the economy is slowing down, unemployment is rising, and importantly, if the stock market is not performing well. Increasingly, stock prices and the behavior of the stock market is taken as a very important signal of whether the economy is going well or is not going well. And at one level, it is true that economic growth, especially in the developing world, is important because it is the one instrument that can allow people to grow out of poverty. So yes, I would very much hope to see economic growth in Africa and in some of the poorest nations of the world, because that will reduce poverty. But my own sense as an economist with many decades of experience is that we need to emphasize more and more other aspects of economic growth. In other words, yes, let's have economic growth, but let's make sure that it is consistent, that it doesn't contradict other important objectives for society. So what sort of thing? Well, let me give you an example. I think that it is fine to have economic growth as long as it is consistent with protection of the environment. I hope you will agree with me when I say that we mustn't push for economic growth if along the way we're going to destroy our forests, poison our water, and contaminate our air, right? Because then what is the virtue of it? Right? We are going to have economic growth for a few years or a few decades, and then this is going to be followed by crisis and calamity and death upon our children or our grandchildren. No, we don't want that. So economic growth has to be framed in a way that environmental protection is very much at the center, right? That we gear our policies in such a way that, yes, we're going to have economic growth, provided that we at the same time safeguard the environment, have a clean air, clean water, and we live to our children and our grandchildren a world that is at least as good, if not better, from an environmental perspective than the world that we were born into, right? So that's one example, but let me give you more. I hope you will agree with me that we wouldn't want governments to put people in concentration camps, to pay them low wages, and to make them work in industries so that the country is competitive and we can sell our exports cheaply on foreign markets, right? That's one way to get economic growth, I assure you. Mechanically speaking, if we just put in concentration camps 20 million people in the United States and force them to work for $1 an hour, the US could become very competitive and we could generate economic growth. But we don't do that. Not only because the US is a mature democracy and that would never be acceptable. We don't do that because we have certain values as a nation. And I'm not only talking about the United States, I'm talking about all the nations of the world. Every member of the United Nations, when they join the United Nations, and 193 members have done it already, they commit themselves to respecting people's rights, to not putting people in concentration camps, to allowing them to enjoy their freedoms, freedom of speech, freedom of mobility, and so on and so forth, right? So you would agree with me that economic growth is fine, but it has to be consistent with respect for people's dignity and respect for their human rights and their civil rights. We live in a world in which there is a great deal of injustices against women. Gender inequality is an illness. In most countries in the world, women, in some form or other, are second-class citizens. I could give you multiple examples, but I will not do that because we don't have the time. So therefore, let's have economic growth, but let's do it in a way that protects the rights of women, that gives them opportunity, that gives them equal wages for equal work, that does not put them at a disadvantage in terms of their property rights, in terms of their mobility. There are countries in the world where women cannot go out into the street unless they have the authority of their husbands or their parents. There are countries in the world where if a woman wants to set up a business, it's more difficult to do than if he is a man. And on and on. There are countries in the world where the Constitution does not guarantee or does not identify gender as a protected category, and so on, right? So, and then of course, another one of the worries of Abdul Baha as he was traveling in America, the whole question of the extremes of wealth and poverty. So we would want to have economic growth, provided that it doesn't worsen income inequality. You can have economic growth by having a handful of people become immensely wealthy. From a purely accounting point of view, you can have economic growth while the majority of the people are actually falling in their living standards, but a few hundred, let's say, are making huge gains and are becoming billionaires, right? Do we want that kind of economic growth? No, we don't want it. Number one, it's not fair because it's depriving of opportunities to the masses. Number two, it's not sustainable. It ultimately undermines the whole social and political order, right? So some notion of equity, some narrowing of the extremes between the very wealthy and the very poor, has to be very much at the center of our economy. I think you begin to get the idea, right? I could give you more examples. Transparency is very important. Integrity in public office is important. The rule of law is important. You don't want to have an economy where you have one rule for the rich and one rule for the rest. Right? You don't want to have an economy where the politicians get one kind of justice, very lenient, very patient, and the rest of the population, get a very rough justice, which very often ends up populating our jails with minor offenses, while the rich and the wealthy get scot-free and are free to enjoy their billions, right? So that's obviously that violates our sense of justice, and we don't want to have that kind of economic growth, which does not have a due respect for the rule of law. And so on. This conversation can go on for a while. I hope that the examples that I have given you suggest to you just the importance of building an economic system that has as the foundation many of these pillars: gender equality, respect for human rights, environmental protection, and so on. And that if we do that, then we have a chance of next time we have a pandemic, not simply witnessing helplessly how 100 or 200 million people become extremely poor, but we have a system which can respond more rapidly, which can protect people from the effects of a calamity, whether it's a pandemic or a hurricane or many of the things that will come our way. And so this vision, which I have sort of discussed, is very much embedded in the writings of the Baha'i faith. The Baha'i faith recognizes the importance of knowledge and science and technology. Baha'u'llah, the founder of the Baha'i faith, said the real treasury of man, and I'm sure he meant women as well, is his or her knowledge. So this idea of expanding the frontiers of knowledge for the benefit of humanity is very much at the center of our conception of the future. But at the same time, in addition to knowledge and technology and science and achievement, it is absolutely essential that our economy be anchored in a set of principles which have a strong moral underpinning. All the things that I have mentioned to you, whether it is the environment, respect for human rights, respect for gender equality, improvements in income distribution, they all have a very strong moral foundation. And so for me, about the only upside that I can see of COVID-19 is that it is forcing our leaders, it's forcing our business community, our civil society organizations, and people like you and me, to think about these issues, and to raise these questions, so that as we move into the future, as we have to confront some of the challenges that are coming our way, we're going to be better prepared to deal with them. All right, friends, I think that I have spoken long enough, so I will pass it back to Alina in the event that perhaps there are some questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lopez. This was wonderful. Thank you for sharing with us all this conversation. If friends would like to share their thoughts or have some questions, please, you're free to do so. Yes, Elliot?
Yes, you rightfully mentioned that there's a big issue if we cannot tackle the problem of poverty and education, healthcare, are all those military expenses, which, over the years have reached, unbelievable levels. Trillions and trillions of dollars. So my question, all those expenses are basically supported by all kinds of lobbies. I have in mind just the recent case in the US with the current budget, where it was proposed that the military expenses would really increase significantly. And when the Pentagon itself saw those numbers, they said, we don't need all that money. And still, Congress did vote on that budget, which is totally insane, that the Pentagon even doesn't need all those billions and billions. And what's so sad is that even progressive members of Congress really did vote for that crazy budget. We have here in the Loudoun County a representative who was elected pretty recently on a progressive platform. And she voted for that crazy military budget. And her reasoning was that basically, well, especially in the Washington, D.C. area, we have a lot of people employed in the military industry. So yes, I voted for it. So my question is, how do you see that, we can end that never-ending circle of military spending, how we can convince, our representatives to stop that craziness and instead invest in our education, our healthcare, etc. I mean, do you see any solution to end that craziness?
All right, it's a good question, and I guess expressed with a great deal of passion. But I can sympathize with your frustrations. I think that, you know, in the context of democracies, and you live in the United States in a, you know, mature democracy, not a perfect democracy by any means, but you know, it's a well-established sort of part of your political system. Typically in democracies, the way you deal with these issues is by you know, through the political process. If I were you, the first thing I would do is I would write to your Congress, to your representative, and lay out the case just as you have laid it, I think, very cogently in your remarks. Politicians are sensitive to the opinions of the voters. But sometimes we voters, and maybe I shouldn't say we because I'm not a US citizen, I have never voted in a US election, and I don't live in the United States at the moment, but you know, the voters sometimes are a little bit indifferent. They don't take their civic responsibilities very seriously. They don't examine closely what their politicians stand for. They don't look at their voting record. Either they don't vote. You know that participation in elections in the US is relatively low. It's voluntary and therefore low. And if they do vote, they vote reflexively, you know, without really thinking, and it's kind of an abdication of their civic responsibilities and duties, and that I think is part of the problem. Then, of course, as you know, there are vested interests involved. These huge allocations to the defense industries. Behind them, very often you have lobbying. You have you know, military industries that are very greedy and always, you know, frame the debate about security in terms of weapon systems and so on. But it is us citizens who have to begin to change the nature of the debate. And I think COVID-19 has given citizens a wonderful opportunity to go back to the politicians and say, hey, I want better hospitals. I don't want more nuclear weapons, because I can get something out of the better hospitals, but I get zero benefit out of more nuclear weapons. You know, I used to work at the IMF, which is a weighty organization in Washington. It's a global organization. And sometimes they like to use euphemistic language, and military spending in IMF jargon is called unproductive expenditures. It's a spending which has very, very few benefits. You know, what's the marginal benefit to you, Mr. Is it Elliot? What is the marginal benefit to you of your country having, you know, 10 more nuclear weapons? It's zero. It's zero, absolutely zero, right? But they are very expensive pieces of machinery, and society would be better if we allocated those resources, you know, to deal with some of the problems that we have, even in countries like the United States, which is, you know, young people who are not getting the kinds of skills that they need, you know, to operate in today's very complex, very rapidly changing economy.
Actually, I did write to our representative, and her response was very straightforward and direct. I mean, she said, I did vote because, I mean, we have so many people in this district working for the military establishment. So I have to just to give up.
Yeah, but you know, you have more people who have children that are in need of better education. You have more people that have a need to have access to good hospital and public health infrastructures, right? What about those, right? I don't know what the statistics are for Loudoun County where you live, but you know, how many, how many of the people that have died from COVID perhaps might have not done so if they had not faced some of the shortages and some of the problems that we're seeing everywhere in the world, including in the United States. Back to you, Alina.
Thank you, Dr. Lopez. Dear Paria, if you don't mind, Sandra could not raise up her hand, but she would like to ask a question.
Yes, I kind of perked up when you said accounting standards, and as a former accountant, I realized almost everything in accounting is short-term, end of the month, end of the quarter, never beyond the end of the year. And everything is very profit-oriented. We're only accounting for money. I'm wondering what your thoughts might be on expanding accounting standards to not always be short-term and to perhaps account for something beyond monetary things. Because I think this plays into Emmanuel's question too. Everybody thinks short-term. If I'm working for a defense contractor and the funding gets cut, I don't want to lose my job. And I never think beyond, what's the benefit to me? There's nothing that forces us to think about the benefits to people beyond our own little circle.
Yeah. I mean, several things come to mind, Sandra. The first, you're absolutely right. I gave several examples of how we should frame economic growth, I was making the case that it should be fine, provided that it is paying adequate regard for the quality of the environment, for respect for human rights, and so on and so forth. Well, one aspect of it, obviously, it has to be sustainable, right? Sustainable. In other words, let's not design a policy that will deliver economic growth for the next 3 years and then collapse and we're back to where we started from shortly thereafter, right? So the notion of sustainability, that it is something that can go on in a way that doesn't put other stresses in the system is very, very important. Now, for those of you who have children, especially children approaching, sort of high school, university, encourage them to go into professions that are going to be more in keeping with the kind of society that we want to build. A society that is characterized by more social justice, by more equity, and so on. Right? I would, if I was in that position, which I'm no longer because my 2 kids are adults, right? But I would encourage my children to go into professions that in some way are going to allow them to serve humanity in ways that do not put at risk, the future of humanity itself. The military-industrial complex ultimately relies on a whole bunch of professionals who are basically there, designing those weapons, designing those systems, those malignant fruits of civilization, to use the terminology of Abdul Baha'i in the Tablet of the Hague. And so I think it is very important that as parents, we gently steer our children into the professions and into the acquisition of knowledge and skills that will ultimately be for the benefit of mankind, that will not put at risk the future of mankind or have other sort of darker implications.
Thank you. Paria June, I think you wanted to ask a question.
Yes, Dr. Lopez, thank you for this very enlightening talk for the past 3 weeks. And, you so beautifully expressed about the approach, even by systems around the world that have maybe more of a military approach and how this should be changed. There was a a journalist and author that spoke about systems around the world. And forgive me that I can't recall her name at the moment, but she wrote a book about it, about conflict, and how in her investigation of systems around the world that were all essentially man-made, that the foundation of all of those systems, in order for it to thrive, was founded on conflict. Whether it was the approach of the political process of getting voted into the governing systems, whether it was about the work and approach, that conflict was actually at the root of all of the decision making. And somehow that as a humanity, we have adopted this as a pattern of thinking that without conflict, we can't seem to push into other elements. And interestingly enough, she said the only system she found in the world that was not man-made, that was conducive to advancing the process of growth and was founded on was not founded on conflict, but rather humility, collaboration, and unity of thought and consultation, was the Baha'i administration. And that, of course, this is the divine governing system. But in knowing this and understanding this about man-made systems, Dr. Lopez, how does a humanity that is living among nations that are part of systems that conflict is at its root, how can we as a people, because maybe waiting for the systems to change will take too much time, as you mentioned, but how do we as a people have to really figure, aside from, of course, we need education, knowledge, how do we wake the souls and minds to the process of understanding how systems, for example, are destroying the lives of indigenous people for centuries systematically, that these are governments doing that. When we think, being raised in Canada, when we think in Canada, it was the government that went and abducted the children of indigenous families and put them in schools, and then had them be adopted and taken by foster families that were white families. But this idea of conformity, this idea of destroying rooted cultures, for example, we know from the devotional programs that without the indigenous knowledge, without the indigenous human family, they are the resource actually for saving the environment. Their entire culture is rooted in the preservation of the environment and the harmony. How do we as a people not fall trapped to the conflict? And what would your recommendation to be as individuals to try to overcome this without having to wait to be, I don't know how to, instead of waiting for the nations and the governments to change, if the system itself is rooted in corruption or is rooted in conflict, excuse me, how does one make a change in a different way? Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Paria. That's an important question that you're raising. And let me just address one aspect of it. As you were talking, I was remembering a conversation I had with William Hatcher many years ago. For those of you in the audience who never met him, William Hatcher was a very eminent member of the Canadian Baha'i community, a professor of mathematics, an extremely distinguished philosopher. And my wife and I, when we were living in Russia in the 1990s, had the opportunity to sort of strengthen our friendship with Bill and Judy, his wife, but especially with Bill, because he was living in St. Petersburg, and we were living in Moscow, and he would come to monthly meetings of the National Assembly of the Baha'is of Russia in Moscow, and he would stay with us for 3 or 4 days every month. And so we became very close friends, and that friendship brought about numerous conversations on a variety of subjects. And I think at the core of what you're saying, Paria, you use the word conflict. Bill would give it a slightly different slant. He would say competition. It's competition for resources that has led to many wars. It's competition for markets that very often comes associated with corruption, with bribery, and with other other abuses. And Bill made a very clear distinction between what he said was competition and what he called the pursuit of excellence. And he used an example in our discussion. He said, think of a piano competition where, brilliant musicians come to basically win the gold medal, right? And what is it that they're doing? They're trying to show that at a particular moment in time, the days of the competition, they can play, let's say, the piano better than everybody else, right? So it's a horizontal comparison at that particular moment in time, and the winner is the person who can persuade the jury that he played the piano better than everybody else. He says this environment, and they do call it a piano competition, he said, does not encourage cooperation. For instance, if one of the days of the competition, one of your fellow competitors comes and seeks your advice and asks you, can you please tell me, how to play better this particular segment of this Beethoven sonata? You might think twice before advising him, you see, because if he does better than you do, he might win the competition. And so at the extreme, you might actually sabotage his performance because that will enhance the possibilities that you will win. It is the reason why in some universities, for instance, as soon as the professor gives a reading reference, sometimes students will rush to the library and cut the paper out of the journal so that nobody else can read it, or things like that, right? These kinds of very, very anomalous behaviors, which sometimes are created in an environment in which there is sort of competition and where one has to excel over others, right? Bill said that what we need to teach our children is actually to pursue excellence. And the pursuit of excellence is totally different. The pursuit of excellence is, you look at your performance today and you say yourself, did I play the piano better today than I did the week before or a month before? And if the answer to that question is yes, and incidentally, that answer is not framed with respect to how you perform with comparing with other people. It is with respect to yourself, right? Did you play better than you played a week ago or a month ago? And if you played better than ever in your life, then you are ahead, even if you don't win the gold medal, right? Because you're pursuing excellence. And when you pursue excellence, there is every incentive to collaborate, to help others, because that is enriching, you see. And so I think that part of our problem is that very often, we are operating in this environment of competition where we want to excel over others, instead of simply looking at ourselves and building our human capacities and trying to be better today than we were a month ago or a year ago. I'm looking at my watch, Alina, and I think that we're coming to the end of the presentation, correct?
Yeah, that's correct, Doctor. Would you mind answering just one last question from Elliot? I think he wants to ask one more. I think after that, we will move into the ending of the program.
All right.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was referring to your comment when you mentioned that we should push our children to select professions which are really improving our conditions in this world. And interestingly enough, I don't have children of my own, but I have colleagues and friends who have children. And in the last few years, I was really struck by the fact that when those children reach the age of, just before going to university, to college, they still don't know what to do. And I thought that's really a strange thing because, in my generation, usually children, they knew more or less what they wanted to do around age 10, if not younger. In my case, I knew more or less what I wanted to do before age 10. And so for the last few years, I was thinking, why is that? And when talking with my friends, colleagues, and thinking on my own, well, I reached the following conclusion. Today, it's very difficult. In the old days, basically, you could make a decent living pretty much in any profession. But today, the number of professions where you can really make a living is really very limited. I mean, it's mostly finance or legal professions like that. And on the contrary, I mean, professions related to education, health. I mean, right now we have a crisis with nurses because nurses don't make enough money. So they are not interested anymore to get into those professions. So I'm wondering, okay, it's very good to push our children to select professions where they can make a difference in improving our world conditions, but how we can rebalance financially so that, I mean, people working in those areas which are really good for the improvement of our world, how those professions can be also financially sustainable. I mean, today it seems we have a huge issue, like I mean, teachers. I mean, it's well known that I have a niece recently, she quit the profession of being a teacher because she said, I mean, our government is not appreciating our work and our salaries cannot sustain our lives. So how you see we could rebalance, I mean, those financial priorities regarding salaries in certain professions?
Yeah, you know, your example is actually a very good one. A few years ago, when I was working at the World Bank, we did a study for the Swedish government looking at some of the reasons why their educational system was under some stress, some pressure, and in particular, why the scores of high school students in some international standardized tests had been coming down for a number of years, whereas those of Finland, a country next door, were the best in the world. And so that created kind of a very interesting question. You know, what is it that one country is doing well that the other country is not doing so well? And so we reviewed the literature. Obviously, a lot of studies had been done looking at this question. And one of the interesting findings was that in Finland, which at that time, which was a few years ago, you know, had the best standardized test scores across all the countries that participated in this exam, which was like 60 countries, including all of the wealthy countries. They had the best paid teachers in the world. Now, isn't that interesting? Because if teachers are earning a very good living, then the profession itself will attract talent. It will attract people who are committed, who are like the activity, but the activity itself is financially rewarding, right? And this gets reflected ultimately in motivated students, motivated teachers, and so on. When we don't value our teachers, when you can earn far more becoming, I'm thinking of developing countries, a lieutenant in the army, right, than being a high school teacher, then you will go for being a lieutenant in the army rather than a high school teacher, even though you may be, you know, quite capable, and you know this will imply a waste of talent and a waste of resources. When teachers are not well paid, then the profession attracts people who are not motivated or who have nothing else to do, and therefore choose the teaching profession. And this is such a side irony, right? Because really it's our children who will ensure the future of our country. It is they who will ultimately you know, lead to economic growth, to prosperity, to human progress, right? So again, your example is a good one, but I have mentioned, you know, that valuing the teaching profession is a very, very good investment that countries can make in their own future. Thank you so much, Alina, and thank you all for your very good questions. And thank you for giving of your time on a Sunday morning or afternoon, as the case may be, depending on your time zone.
Thank you, Dr. Augusto. I think Ismael wishes to share some final thoughts.
No,
thank you, Alina.
Okay.
Thank you, Alina. Thank you, Dr. Augusto Lopez-Claros. Thank you so much for taking your time. You're international and coming to give us this Baha'i perspective on how we can manage the daily affairs of this world that is being challenged. And we surely welcome you another time to come and join us. We'll keep in touch. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. We'll proceed with our final part of the program, which will be two prayers. One will be a healing prayer in dedication to all those who are going through struggles, and also not just for healing the wounds of physical world, but also spiritually and emotionally. And also after that, we will share a prayer for the departed. And if friends would like to share the names of their loved ones who have passed away in the chat room, they're welcome to do so. This is a service we're all providing, and we're all welcome to share the names of our loved ones in the chat. Thank you. Thank you, Maria June.
Thank you.
Tu nombre es mi curación. Y el recuerdo de ti es mi remedio. La proximidad de ti es mi esperanza. Es mi curación y mi socorro, tanto en este mundo como el venidero. de la justicia, ¿dónde puede ir un amante? Si no es a la tierra de su amada. ¿Y qué buscador encuentra descanso? Lejos del deseo de su corazón, lejos del deseo de su corazón. Para el verdadero amante la reunión es vida y la separación es muerte. Es muerte. De paciencia y su corazón no está en paz. Su pecho está desprovisto de paciencia y su corazón no está en paz. De la justicia, ¿dónde puede ir un amante? Si no es a la tierra de su amada. ¿Y qué buscador encuentra descanso? Lejos del deseo de su corazón, lejos del deseo de su corazón. Para el verdadero amante la reunión es vida y la separación es muerte. Es muerte. Por apresurarse a la morada de su amada. Renunciaría a una miríada de vidas por apresurarse a la morada de su amada. Su amada.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us this morning. Thank you, Dr. Lopez, for sharing with us and enlightening us with your knowledge. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good weekend.